Hello everyone, and welcome to the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast, where light and technology come together. I'm your host, Jason Odell, and today I'm going to be talking about software options for Nikon shooters, people who are using Nikon NEF files as their primary RAW file. And joining me, I've got an interview with fellow photographer and a friend of mine, Mike Hagen. Mike Hagen's a professional photographer, he's a book author, educator, and a workshop leader. And he runs a company called Visual Adventures out of Washington State in the United States. And he's been a professional photographer since 1998. We've both written books on Nikon's Capture NX2. We both use the software a lot, so we're familiar with that. And he's also the director of the Nikonians Academy workshops, which you can check out at www.nikoniansacademy.com. So let me get Mike on the show, and we're going to talk about Nikon NEFs and workflow. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast. How are you, sir?
Hey, Jason. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today.
Great. Well, today we're going to sort of talk about a subject that we're both very familiar with, and that's the current state of editing software options for Nikon NEF shooters. There's been some updates to Capture NX that kind of threw us all for a little bit of a loop. Why don't you give us some background on what's going on with that?
Yeah, so as a lot of Nikon shooters know, Nikon recently changed their premier RAW editing software from Nikon Capture NX2 to a new software with the name of Nikon Capture NX-D. And the D, I guess, stands for develop. Is that right? D for develop?
I honestly don't know. And we should point out that this is just beta right now. It's available for free as a beta test. It's not been officially released.
Right, exactly. So they're testing. We'll say we're testing Nikon Capture NX-D. And so for a lot of Nikon shooters, a lot of us who shoot the Nikon RAW file, the NEF, we've come to rely on Nikon Capture NX2 over the years because of the way that it processes RAW files, Nikon RAW files. And specifically, especially with the Nikon Capture NX2 version, we always had this new color control point software. And that software is great because it allowed us to select areas like the clouds or the sky or maybe someone's face. And without having to do a lot of detailed selections like you'd have to do in Photoshop, we could very quickly adjust an image. So NX-D is a departure from that because NX-D doesn't have the color control points. It doesn't have the selection control points. And so now it's basically a fundamental RAW processing software, maybe similar to like Adobe Camera Raw. So we lose all the regional and local fix ability. So that leaves us all now sitting here going, well, what's next? You know, what do we do if we're a Nikon RAW shooter? How do we adjust our photos? Do we go to Lightroom? Do we go to Aperture? Do we go to some other software package? And so that's really what we're going to talk about today is NX2 and what's out there, what's next for us.
Yeah, and you know, I did try the beta version of Capture NX-D. I was also surprised to see that it had removed basically all of the local adjustments from the editing, and the fundamental challenge with it, if our viewers want to go out and download the beta, and keep in mind it is a beta, and so it has bugs, and you know I ran into some things where it liked to crash a little bit, but you know that happens with beta software.
Yep.
It's using a fundamentally different file modification. Whereas from Capture NX2, which means the compatibility between the two products is pretty much not there. NX-D is moving to a form of sidecar file for storing all the edits, the metadata, etc. Now this sidecar files have been around for years, XMP sidecar files. NX-D is going to be using, I don't even remember what the file extension is, but its own proprietary sidecar file. They're stored in a different folder. Not just alongside your images, but the big impact of that sidecar transition means that it's not going to read Capture NX2 edits very well. You can't go back and forth between the two editors. So, you know, NX-D is a product that I believe will be offered for free. So we got to, you know, Nikon does answer their criticism on having a free RAW converter.
Right.
But I think for people who've been using Capture NX, I mean, you really need to think about this because there really is no transition to even Capture NX-D without doing a lot of stuff. Right now, at least in the beta form, NX-D will not read your control point edits, for example.
Yeah, and I was just looking at some photos today, actually. I was looking at a photo I had processed, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago maybe. It was a bird in Africa, and I wanted to change the saturation of the sky behind the bird. And so I dropped a couple of color control points and, saturated the sky. It was a very easy thing to do. Looked at it this morning in Capture NX-D, and that sky was no longer saturated behind the bird. So it's not reading those changes for us. So that transition, like you say, if you've been an NX2 user for the last 5-6 years or however long the software's been out, now we have to think about, okay, we have to set those color control point edits and other localized edits from NX2. We have to set those in stone somehow. So that's going to involve us finding those images, finding the ones we edited years past, and then exporting them out or saving them as maybe a TIFF. Well, actually, yeah, a TIFF. I think that's your options in NX2 are TIFF, JPEG, or NEF. You don't want to save it out as a NEF because that's going to save the old control points, right?
And I guess you're bringing up an interesting point. That save as NEF, if you're saving from a RAW file, you can save a TIFF in a NEF enclosure from Capture NX2 or a JPEG. But then again, that doesn't give you anything unless you're using NX2 to apply adjustments to it. So your best bets at this point are to think of, I think there's two things that NX2 users need to consider. The first thing to consider is that, given that NX-D is going to be a radical transition anyway, you have to ask yourself, what am I going to transition to? And the reason why we bring this up, and I think it's important for everyone to understand, is that Nikon's made it pretty clear that when NX-D comes out, Capture NX2 will no longer be supported.
Right.
That's pretty strong words when a company says no longer supported, because that means there won't be registration support, there will not be new camera support, there will not be bug fix support. So even though you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, I'm okay because it works on my computer.
Right.
I don't have a new camera. I'm not getting a new camera today. I'll cross that bridge when I get there. Well, consider a situation where, there's a new tweak to your OS and it introduces a bug. That bug isn't going to be fixed. And now you're in a situation where you got all your NEFs and you may not be able to use NX2 to get your control point stuff set in stone to export them as TIFFs.
Yeah, and so if you're a Windows user, if you're using Windows 7 and haven't transitioned to Windows 8 or 8.1, so you need to think about that. If you're on NX2 and you're thinking, okay, well, my next computer or on this computer, I'm going to upgrade my operating system to Windows 8. Well, you may not want to do that. You may want to get all of your files transitioned from where you're at today before you do an operating system upgrade. And the same thing for Mac users. I think, Jason, you and I are both Mac users.
Right.
What happens when we go to OS X 10 point whatever, 10.8, 9,
or
OS
even
X
just
11?
the next iteration. I mean, who knows? There could be a bug introduced in the next incremental update. You don't know that.
Yeah.
Now, we've got a little runway here because Nikon has certainly said that, hey, we're going to continue to add camera support to Capture NX2 until Capture NX-D is officially released. And right now it's still in beta. They've only said summer.
Summer of 2014, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Which means you have till June if you want to be really safe. It might be later. It might be, but if you give yourself a June deadline to be making some kind of transition. So the question then for our NEF shooters is, what are my alternatives? And what should I be doing to transition? So I know we both use Adobe Photoshop Lightroom 5. Is that correct?
Yep, I'm a Lightroom 5 user, and I'm in the Creative Cloud now too. Just about 6 months ago, I went to the Creative Cloud, so I've got all the CC software. But yeah, definitely Lightroom. Lightroom has been my I'll say over the last number of years, even as I've been a Nikon Capture NX2 user. And I just got to tell you, I love Capture NX2. I mean, you and I both loved it. We used it a lot.
Absolutely.
But, and we both wrote books on it. Oops. I'm so excited. I'm shaking my camera here.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, we both
wrote books in LA, so watch out.
Oh, yeah. And I'm on the Pacific Coast, so maybe we're getting aftershocks here. No, but the point is Capture NX2 is a great software package. But the thing that it wasn't great at is it wasn't great at helping you organize your system. NX2 has always been a sort of standalone editor. It's always been a program that has been kind of outside of your organizational structure. So what I've done over the last years is I've used Lightroom as my hub of operations. And when I teach people Lightroom, or when I'm explaining how I use Lightroom, that's it. I use Lightroom as my basis of operation. So I come back from a trip, I'm doing my keywording in Lightroom, I'm doing all my file structures in Lightroom, and I'll even develop or edit my photos in Lightroom as much as I can. But with any software package, you and I both know this, there comes a point where you kind of come up against a wall. And you're like, okay, that's as far as I can go in Lightroom. And now it's time to start looking at going out to some other package, like NX2, or maybe like, I don't know, any of the other software packages out there that we love and use. Maybe a software like a Nik plugin or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I guess the idea here is that transitioning from NX2 to another software package, my strong recommendation is to to use a software package that lets you use a hub of operation, or lets you organize your photos in some type of hub. So that would be Aperture, it would be Lightroom, or maybe even the Phase 1 product, which is called
Capture One.
Capture One, right?
Right, Capture One.
So any of these programs let you organize your files, and then you can work on them in those programs, but then maybe go out to some other software packages you see fit.
Yeah, and you know, even if you were using Capture NX2, there was a limit to what it could do. You'd still want to send your images, say, to plugins or to Photoshop as a TIFF. I mean, this was all part of digital workflow. The nice thing about the three products you mentioned, Lightroom, Capture One, Aperture, is that they all use, or all now have, a image management kind of catalog database as their core. And there's a tremendous difference when you're using a catalog as your hub, rather than a browser file open, file save approach, where you pick an image, you edit it in your editor, open in Photoshop, like just Bridge Photoshop. There's a classic example of browser editor. Okay,
or Photomechanic.
Yeah, Photomechanic is another really good one, and one I use even now still. There's so much you can get out of the raw converter. Sometimes you need to go beyond that. So, of these three packages, all of them, I mean, I've tried them all as well. Just, I'm in your same situation. You need to be familiar with what your clients are using when you're teaching and leading workshops. So it's good to know. I've discovered that certainly with Aperture and with Lightroom, I haven't tried the latest version of Capture One, but Capture One had always been good for NEF files. I don't see any quality compromises coming out of Lightroom, coming out of Aperture. I honestly don't. So I think anybody who is concerned about raw processing going forward, and they're concerned that they're not going to get a quality product out of one of conversion out of these, those are old days are gone.
Yeah, a lot of Nikon shooters over the years have, I'll say, relied on Capture NX2 because pretty much out of the box, if you open up one of your NEF files in Nikon Capture NX2, Nikon applied all of its own secret sauce to the images. So all those menu settings that we would adjust in the past, things like picture controls or in-camera sharpening or de-lighting, these things that would enhance the photo. Well, Nikon Capture NX2 would see them and then immediately show them to you. And so we get these great-looking images with almost no work at all, and that's what we came to know and love about NX2. Well, as you and I both know, we can get to the same place using Lightroom. It just requires a little bit different approach. You need to understand that there's some camera profiles in Lightroom that mimic the Nikon picture controls.
Right.
So doing the camera profile, that's a big step. And then there's all kinds of other slider adjustments where with maybe 2 or 3 quick slider adjustments, you can get to the same place, the same look. And then in terms of quality, like you were assessing, or you were talking about, noise, not an issue. Noise or dealing with noise is not an issue in Lightroom or Aperture or the Phase 1 product. They all do a great job and produce an impeccable image file. There's no issue with blowing up big photos or creating images shot at ISO 6400 for wall prints. All of these other software packages will give you the same, I'll say, output quality that Capture NX2 would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen the exact same thing. It's just more of a slightly manual process, but understand that through shortcuts like presets,
Hmm.
tweaking your default conversion settings. So, for
Hmm.
example, Lightroom has a default conversion setting that most people didn't like. It's using a
Yeah,
particular profile, a particular sharpening setting. It
pretty
doesn't.
flat.
It's pretty flat, which was intentional. It doesn't apply, for example, lens profile corrections. And yet all of those things are available in Lightroom. And if you change your defaults to always say turn on lens profile corrections,
Hmm.
chromatic aberration removal, guess what? When you bring your images into Lightroom, they're going to have those effects already applied. Those adjustments will already be there for you. You won't have to go in every time and check the box. And
Yeah,
of those three products you already mentioned, Lightroom's calibration lets you emulate Nikon's picture control. I don't think the other two have that.
you
Um,
know, years ago, I remember there was a third-party company, and I've forgotten the name now, but there was a third-party company that made a plug-in for Apple Aperture for Nikon camera profiles or
oh, really?
control
Picture controls?
picture controls. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, so they
those
may still
things.
exist. They may still exist, and so I think there is for at least Aperture the picture control for Nikon. There's a plugin that you can get. It's like I remember it was $19 if I
Okay.
recall.
And just, for those who care, all picture controls really are is a baseline raw conversion that sets the tone curve, the contrast,
Right.
and the color rendition. You can tweak things with these other raw processors to get those picture controls, and in some cases you can even go farther. For example, you can use a color checker profile card, a color
Sure.
checker card. I have one of those, and you can make your own profile for your own cameras to use in a product like Lightroom, which gives you an entirely different option for getting more accurate color than even what Nikon had.
Yeah, and you know, for a lot of the stuff that you and I do, you and I tend to bias ourselves towards landscape and outdoor photography and this type of thing. And you know, getting quote accurate colors in those scenarios is not always the intent. You know, yes, we do want it to render the scene accurately, but a lot of times, you know, we're interested in the sunset or the redness or the oranges or the yellows, and so doing the or getting perfectly accurate um, color profiles is not always the intent with us landscape photographers. So, so I guess my point is that in Lightroom and in Capture NX2, we can achieve everything we need to even without going with, like, I think you were mentioning the X-Rite color checker, right? That's what
Right.
you're
Yeah,
referring
it's
to.
it's a nice little product. I mean,
Yeah,
you can use it, but you don't need to.
yeah,
It's just another way of tweaking the way that your raw
yep,
file has its colors viewed by these raw converters.
yeah,
Now, so then the question is then if you're sitting on a pile of Nikon raw files,
yeah.
NEFs, which have been adjusted, and you've stored those adjustments inside your NEFs just like we do. Um, what do you want to do before you transition into one of these other programs? I mean, what are the things that you can do?
Well, I guess speaking personally, so you know, being a guy who has done a lot of Nikon Capture NX2 edits over the years, I think I'm at the beginning of this, like many of us are. We're just trying to assess, all right, what are the next maybe 3 months mean, 3 to 6 months mean for us? You know, my approach will be to go back through my raw files over the years, and so probably I'll do a year by year search or even folder by folder search and find those images that have been edited in Capture NX2 with control points, you know, with saturation adjustments, whatever. Then just use Nikon Capture NX2's bulk processing. You know, it's got the gear icon. I've just like
Yeah,
automation.
the automated from the browser. I think you can even do this.
Exactly, from the browser. And so what I'll do is I'll click that, select all the images that have edits, and I'm just going to be exporting out TIFFs. I'll just the highest quality TIFFs, and I'll put them in the same folder as the original. And so basically what I'll have is I'll have my original file name, you know, Hagen, you know, the date, and then my numerical code at the end, 1234, .nef. So that's still going to be the original nef. And then I'll also have right underneath it, Hagen, blah, 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 1234 dot TIFF. And I'll just know from here on out that that TIFF has been a modified file from the NEF.
Right. And that's exactly what I've been telling my, I actually had some online classes this past weekend. We were
Mm,
talking about Lightroom in
right.
particular. I mean, you really got two options when it comes to moving your files. You can just, throw caution to the wind, move everything into the editor, into the Lightroom or Aperture or whatever, and just figure you'll reprocess files. Now, I, or you could take the, alternative approach, which is anything that's ever been edited in Capture NX, you make a TIFF out of. I would say it probably for me it's somewhere in the middle.
Mm.
Images that are just basic adjustments and not prize-winning, hanging in the Louvre images.
So you mean things like white balance, basic exposure, those types of
Yeah, I mean, if
adjustments?
it's
Yeah.
just an image that I maybe edited, or if it's just one that I was playing with, it's not something hanging on the wall
Right.
necessarily, where I want to preserve those adjustments so that I could print it that way again. You can bring those into Lightroom. But for ones that were like important images to you, images that are in maybe your stock portfolio or images that you're
Hmm.
selling or whatever that you had for a client, you'll want to bring the TIFF in. And one thing, if you wanted to get really picky about it, and this is just a little tip, um, I I would suggest going into NX on your very best images,
Right.
just the ones that you really want to make sure are good, and turn down your sharpening or even
Mm.
disable your sharpening. And the reason for that is then make an unsharpened TIFF so that you're not baking in any sharpening halos at all.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Jason. I like that idea.
And then you bring it into, say, Lightroom or bring it into Aperture, bring it into Phase 1, Capture 1. You can apply adjustments to your TIFFs in those editors, in
Sure.
those catalog programs, non-destructively. So it's really nice to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to, and here's the thing. Capture NX, we've been using it essentially in its current form since when? 2008.
Yep.
Okay, that's when I mean, it's been updated a few times, but nothing significant
Right.
in terms of the way it processes. Well, Lightroom, Aperture, they use different and more modern sharpening algorithms. It's
Yep.
actually pretty hard to create halos in Lightroom, I've
It
discovered.
is.
I mean, you can do it. You just have to crank things up to the point of where you would never go.
Yep.
So those concerns that we had over baking in halos and things like that, you might consider.
So you're suggesting, I guess, to build on this is maybe from the automation in the or take one file, set the sharpening to 0, and then maybe select all the images in the Capture NX2 browser and just paste the 0 sharpening adjustment across all those images.
I wish it were that easy. This is where it gets to be a little bit messy. If you're only using the picture control sharpness settings,
Yeah. Right.
then that's no problem. You can
Right.
batch it
Good
out.
point.
Where
Yeah.
it becomes an issue is if you've added unsharp mask adjustment steps to your images in the edit list. There's no way you can get rid of
Yeah.
those except for
That's a
going
one
in
by one.
one by one, which is why I would say this is the kind of thing you do with your best images.
Yeah.
At least, however, for me, and I've been using Lightroom for about a year now, a little over a year now, and I'm, by and large, I'm very comfortable now using the tools to get quality images, and it doesn't take me terribly long. I had to
Hmm.
learn it, I had to practice, but it doesn't take
Sure.
me a tremendous amount of time to replicate the same kind of adjustments that I was getting with control points,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And I know I've still got my plugins. I can still do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Images
As
that
you
were
were.
that way, I can just bring in.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking of at least one thing I wanted to mention, and that is, a lot. I think one of the things that Nikon shooters will be pushing back on. They've communicated this to me over the years is that, hey, we really like Capture NX2 because it would save all of our edits inside the raw
Mhm.
file. In
Mhm.
other words, I didn't have to have a lot of different versions of the files. I could make one black and white, I could make one cropped, I could make another one super saturated, and I could save all those as versions in Nikon Capture NX2 or in the NEF file. And then the next time I open it up, if I wanted to see the raw file, see the black and white from the raw
Mhm.
file, you just click on the version. And so basically it was a space saving technique that a lot of shooters use to save, our
Right,
hard
right.
disk drives. Well, now having to export out a bunch of TIFFs, well, we're going to have more files. You're going to have to get maybe some bigger hard drives. But I would just tell people I wouldn't worry so much about that. You know, disk drives are relatively inexpensive these days. You know, if I was just looking at online yesterday or the day before, 4 terabyte drive for like $150 or $180.
Exactly.
So don't worry so much about the extra files that you're going to create from this export. If you're like most Nikon Capture NX2 users, you probably don't have 10,000 photos that you actually edited in Nikon Capture NX2.
Or that are 10,000 photos that you edited and are selling like that.
Bingo, exactly right. Yeah, you may have worked on 10,000 photos over the years, but I don't know many shooters who actually have spent that much time physically editing and outputting and preparing tens of thousands of photos. So, you know, we're talking, what, 500 or 1,000 photos maybe that to export out of NX2 in the pristine shape. That's not that much in terms of file size and disk drive. So don't worry so much about how much extra space you have, that you're going to have to think about when you export.
Now, when you moved over to, you know, you're moving over to Lightroom, have you come across any tips that you can pass on for someone, you know, whether they're moving to Lightroom, to Aperture, wherever? Have you I've got a couple of things I want to hear what you have to say about, you know, things that you can do beforehand, because, you know, one thing about this exercise, and it's not a, you know, it's you know, painful a little bit to have to go through anytime there's a transition or a change.
Sure.
But sometimes we can use that to our advantage. And, you know, one thing, for example, is like you can go through your images and say, you know, I got a lot of out of focus shots or things that I just never really pruned out of my library here. Maybe I won't even bring those into Lightroom or Aperture or Capture One. You know, just this is a good time to reassess all of your images and where they stand.
Sure. Yeah, what I recommend anytime anyone's making a transition maybe into Lightroom is that you start today with the new preferred state. In other words, starting today, I am now a Lightroom user. And so everything I do from here forward into 2015 and 16 and 17, everything I do from here forward, I'm going to try to do as perfect and follow my model as closely as I can. So what I mean by that is making sure your files are in the right folders, making sure you have a process for importing, that all of your presets are set, and all this, you know, everything's set for here today into the future. Now, we all have this problem, and this problem is we've got from yesterday back until 2001, 2002, when we started shooting digital. So I got all these old photos, and somehow I have to transition them into my new system. Maybe my new system's Lightroom. Okay, well, I think the worst thing you can do is take all, let's just say, 250,000 images and just plunk them into Lightroom. I think that's a mistake, right? It's a big mistake because there's all kinds of bad stuff that can happen. There's all these photos that maybe we don't want anymore, like you were just describing. So my recommendation is, let's start with last week's photos. You know, the most recent ones that that we know and understand. We knew where they were. We knew what folders they're in. Let's take those old photos and move them in maybe a week at a time or a folder at a time. Let's get them into that new structure right away. And as part of that, now we have this Capture NX2 transition that we're going to have to do. So let's go find the 10 or 15 photos that we edited in Capture NX2, save them out as TIFFs. All right, so you see what I'm describing is we're taking a small chunk. We're doing the NX2 transition to Lightroom with making the TIFFs, and now we're bringing it into Lightroom. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to go back to last month and do a whole month. All right, now I'm going to go back through and get all of 2014. Now that's done. I've just transitioned this chunk over. Now let's go to 2013, transition the chunk. Just do it in manageable chunks so that if you make a big mistake, you can get back quickly without having, you know, 250,000 shots that you're like, oh no.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I mean, the good news about most of these programs is that they make batch operations, you know, you can go back and change things very, very simple and relatively fast. I would add to your comments here. I mean, that's perfect. That is excellent, sage advice. You know, start slow. That is the #1 thing. And to add to that, not only for the reasons that you gave about, having all those images. But you're going to find your way around the software easier when you have a smaller catalog.
Yeah.
You're going to learn some settings that you might want to change to new defaults. Lightroom has this interesting ability of being able to change its default processing settings. The problem is that it doesn't, if you change them, it doesn't affect anything that's already been imported into the catalog.
Right.
And that drove me nuts for the first few times, because why wasn't anything changing? Well, it leaves your imported images alone with whatever settings they have. It preserves them because it doesn't want to mess with those.
Yep.
But what it will do is it'll apply default settings for camera calibration, lens corrections, sharpening. That'll apply them new when you bring new images in. So if you start slowly work out some settings, then you can change your default so that when you bring new settings in, you're actually reducing the amount of work you have.
Yes.
And you get your pictures coming up in the library looking the way you want them to look, like with a standard picture control emulation or neutral or whatever it might be.
Yep.
And that helps tremendously. Another thing that I've also keep in mind when you talk about doing your housekeeping, getting rid of shots. Another thing you might want to consider doing is organizing your folder structure on your computer if you haven't done that already. You mentioned years. I mean, I do this. My top level folder is a date. It's 2013, 2014, and then subfolders underneath based on whichever kind of criteria I want. Lightroom and Aperture and these other programs will honor that directory structure even though you're looking at them in the catalog.
Sure.
And it makes finding, if I know I can go to my 2014 folder and click on Colorado and say, I don't have to do a search on keywords to find everything. So it's an opportunity to set yourself up for success by cleaning up your workflow.
Yeah, the word opportunity is what was coming to my mind. It's a forced opportunity. It's an opportunity for us digital photographers to get our houses in order. I've written a book on the workflow of digital photography, and I get a lot of questions from people like, oh my gosh, my file structure is in chaos. What do I do? Well, take this as your opportunity to get some sanity around your file structure and your organizational system.
Right.
And then when you transition into your new software, Lightroom or Aperture or whatever, you're good to go because it all makes sense. Lightroom looks the same as your disk drive. You can find your folders, you can find your files. It's all organized and understood. So,
right, and embrace the change. Don't fight the change.
Hey man, we're Nikon shooters. We don't like change, right?
That's right. There's
embrace the change, man.
But look at the benefits of moving over your workflow to one of these other applications too. I mean, we're talking about this from the perspective of guys who've been Nikon shooters since, in my case, 1987. I was the first, where I had my first real, my first Nikon, not borrowing one of my parents. There are other cameras out there too. A lot of them are really nice.
Yeah, exactly.
And to have to shift your workflow around between different editors is also a waste. That costs brain cells. I don't have enough brain cells left. So it opens up that possibility of being able to edit let's say you go out and get one of those Fujis that I was talking about with Tony Sweet a few weeks ago. I mean, now you can edit everything in the same environment.
And you have the same workflow for if you're a Canon shooter, if you're a Nikon shooter, or Fuji, or an Olympus, the new Micro Four Thirds, or the new mirrorless. You're exactly right. All of your stuff is in the same workflow, and you were mentioning how many brain cells it takes to learn all of these different pieces of software. That's one of the biggest things I hear from people who come to my workshops. Like, oh my gosh, am I supposed to get the Nik plugins or the On1 plugins? Am I supposed to use Lightroom and Aperture? And Mike Hagen, you say that you use these 3 or 4 different software packages. I don't have the time or the energy or the brain power to learn all this. So that's the advantage of just sticking with maybe Lightroom, because it all fits in the same workflow. The same, the shadow slider works the same on a Fuji file as it does on a Nikon file, and it's just consistent across the board.
Absolutely. So, we'll take this opportunity just to say, if you are a Capture NX2 user right now, not June, not August, right now is the time to consider your way forward, so that not only will you have learned the software, you'll have it comfortable. And you know what? If Capture NX2 continues to work for you as an external editor, great. But don't put yourself up. Don't set yourself up for a situation where one day something stops working and now you cannot access your edited NEF files because your software isn't working and you need to reinstall it. And guess what? It's not supported. That would be tragic. We don't want that to happen.
And so just to add to that, I'd say, given what we know now about NX-D, the new version of the Nikon processor, it doesn't look like it will support the NX2 edits. So given what we know, we both, I think, suggest it's time to start thinking about transitioning maybe away from NX2 as your base editor and getting into another software package. If this all changes and come June, NX-D supports the control points and everything else, well, okay, let's reassess. But at this point, like you're saying, we need to get ourselves set up for the reality that NX2 is no longer supported and those control points are no longer applicable, and off we go into another editor.
Right, and that's, couldn't have said it better. It's time to get on it. One thing as well, just most of these programs have trial versions, so you don't have to buy something right now. You can get a trial version of Lightroom. You can get a trial version of Aperture if you're a Mac user. I believe the same is true for Capture One. Find one that you prefer to use. I mean, I know that you and I use Lightroom, but that's where we've just chosen to go. It's not that there aren't other alternatives out there. For people who are looking into Lightroom specifically, what I would say is consider that Lightroom is still available as a perpetual use license. You can buy the product. It also is included in the Creative Cloud that you mentioned, and I believe through the end of March of 2014, so just for another couple weeks here, Adobe is offering that photography package. $9.99 US a month for your first year subscription. Nobody can guarantee what it'll be after that first year, but I don't think they're not intending to raise the price. And then you get Photoshop and Lightroom combined.
Photoshop CC, the full pro version. It's a fire sale price. I mean, I can't even hardly believe it.
Right.
So that's great price.
It's something to consider. I memean, that's available through Adobe's website. I don't work for them. They don't pay me to say that, but I just noticed that deal is out there. So
and just real quick, the reason that I've chosen to use Lightroom as kind of my hub of operation is probably two or three reasons. One of them is there's critical mass. Not that I want to follow the crowd all the time, but there are so many shooters out there using Lightroom that it's supported well. Adobe is on it. Whenever a new camera comes out, they update the software, so they respond quickly because there are so many users. The next reason I like using Lightroom is because the training resources out there are extensive. It seems like every famous photographer has a book or a video series. There's a video training online, quite extensive video training. There's workshops all around the country. And so there just seems to be so much support for Lightroom that it makes good sense to go there. And then the third reason is I think that the quality that I get from Lightroom is epic. It's stunning. It's great. And especially with the noise reduction. I don't know if many of our users have used the noise reduction in Lightroom, but it's one of the best I've used over my years, and it's excellent. So
I second all of those points on that, and I would even add to it, if you're gonna use a front end to some of the more powerful features in Photoshop, then Lightroom is it has some features for sending images to Photoshop that are unique that the other ones cannot do. And the thing that blew me away as a longtime Capture NX2 user was I had to teach myself how to use the Lightroom brushes. This was foreign to me for a long time. But you get the hang of the brushes, but here's the really cool thing that what it does. is that unlike Capture NX2, Lightroom reprocesses raw data on local adjustments.
Exactly.
And that is a huge thing when it comes to blending exposure, changing white balance. You're not doing a kludge of a brightness setting or a contrast or a temperature color shift. You're actually making raw adjustments with those brushes and gradients. And that's just a cool thing. So that's one of the reasons why I quickly picked that up and said, I'm going with that.
Yeah, I like Lightroom.
All right. Well, hey, Mike, thank you so much for joining me today on the Sensor Plane podcast. Tell our listeners again where your website is and where they can find you online.
Great. So I operate a company called Visual Adventures. The website is www.visadventures. So that's Viz Adventures. And in that business, I'm an author. I do a lot of workshops, and I do a lot of training as well. And then I also am the director of the Nikonians Academy, and we run a lot of trips around the world. We do a lot of classroom training as well. And that website is nikoniansacademy.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to catch up again on a future episode and follow up and see whether our predictions were right, see where it happens, where we are 6 months from now, and see how it goes.
Right on.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, Jason, thanks a lot.
You got it.